Rosa Parks is a civil rights activist and recognized as the mother of the modern civil rights movement in America. Her refusal to surrender her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery bus in 1955 triggered a wave of protest that reverberated throughout the United States and redirected the course of Black history. If you enjoy content like this, you can find more content like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on my Patreon page or my Buy Me Coffee in the description below. Lastly, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's get started. Rosa Lewis McCauley was born February 4th, 1913 in Tuskegee, Alabama. She was the first child of James and Leanna Edwards McCauley. Her father worked as a carpenter and as a builder, and her mother worked as a teacher. Later, her family would move to her grandparents' house in Pine Level, Alabama in 1923, and her mother would enroll her into Montgomery's institutional school for girls because of the lack of public schools for Black children. After finishing, enrolled in Alabama's normal school because the city of Montgomery did not provide any Black high schools until 1938. As Rosa Parks was preparing for the 11th grade, her mother became ill, so she dropped out of school to care for the house and take care of her mother, and she got her first job. In 1923, Rosa married Raymond Parks, who was a barber in Montgomery, Alabama, and a long-term supporter of the NAACP. He also supported her efforts to earn her high school diploma, which she completed in 1933, in a time where fewer than 7% of African Americans had their high school diploma. In 1943, Rosa Parks became active in the civil rights movement when she joined the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and was elected their secretary. Later, she would state that I was the only woman there and they needed a secretary and I was too timid to say no. She would continue as secretary until 1957. In her capacity as secretary of the NAACP, she worked at voter registration drives because so few African Americans were registered to vote in Montgomery, Alabama. Raymond Parks himself was never able to register to vote in Alabama. In 1944, she also investigated the gang rape of Reese Taylor, a Black woman in Ableville, Alabama, and she helped organize the Committee for Equal Justice for Miss Reese Taylor. She would also continue to work as an anti-rape activist, and she helped organize protests in support of Gertrude Perkins, another Black woman that was raped by 2 Montgomery police officers. In 1955, Emmett Till was brutally murdered for reportedly flirting with a white woman while in Money, Mississippi. November 27, 1955, Rosa Parks attended a meeting at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery to address the case. The featured speaker was T.R.M. Howard, a civil rights leader from Mississippi who led the Regional Council for Negro Leadership. Howard brought news of the recent acquittal of the 2 men that had been accused of murdering Emmett Till. Parks was deeply angered and saddened by the news, particularly because the case had garnered so much attention and still the 2 men were set free. This incident profoundly changed her. Later, during an interview for Vanity Fair in 1998, Reverend Jesse Jackson would state he spoke to Rosa Parks and that she thought about going to the back of the bus, but when she thought about Emmett Till, she simply couldn't do it. See, around the turn of the century, Montgomery passed city ordinances segregated bus passengers by race. Conductors were empowered to assign seats to achieve this goal, but according to the law, no passenger was required to move or give up their seat or stand if the bus was crowded and no other seats were available. But over time, Montgomery bus drivers adopted the practice of requiring Black bus riders to move if there were no white seats left. The way this worked is that the first 4 seats in each Montgomery bus were reserved for whites. The bus had a colored section for Black people and was generally in the rear of the bus. The sections were not fixed and determined by the placement of a movable sign. Black people could sit in the middle rows until the white section filled, and if more whites needed seats, Blacks were to move to the rear of the bus or stand up, or if there was no room at all, leave the bus completely. Black people could not sit across the aisle from a row that was occupied by whites, and the driver could move the colored section or remove it altogether. If white people were already sitting in the front of the bus, Black people also had to pay their fare in the front of the bus, disembark, and re-enter in the rear of the bus. For years, the Black community complained that this situation was simply unfair, and Parks echoed this sentiment. She stated, "Resenting my mistreatment on the bus did not begin with her arrest. I did a lot of walking in Montgomery." For example, In 1943, Parks boarded a bus and paid her fare. Then she moved to her seat, but driver James F. Blake told her to follow city rules and to re-enter the bus again from the back door. When Parks exited the vehicle, the driver drove off and Parks had to wait for the next bus. From that moment on, Rosa Parks was determined that she would never ride with James F. Blake ever again. But as fate would have it, December 1st, 1955, after working all day, she boarded the Montgomery City bus around 6 p.m. Parks paid her fare and sat in the first empty seat in the row designated for the colored section. This was towards the middle of the bus, about 10 seats behind the area reserved for white passengers. Initially, she did not notice that the driver was James F. Blake from the incident in 1934, and as the bus traveled along its regular route, all the white passenger seats began to fill up. As the bus reached its third stop, several more white passengers boarded. Blake noted that 2 or 3 white passengers had to stand because the front of the bus was filled to capacity, so Blake moved the colored sign behind where Parks had been seating and demanded her and 3 other black passengers give up their seats so that white passengers could sit down. Blake said, "Y'all better make light of yourselves and let me have those seats." 3 of them complied, but Parks didn't get up. She slid closer towards the window seat. Blake asked, "Why don't you get up?" And she responded, "I don't think I should have to stand up." So Blake simply called the police. Simplifications of Parks' story claim that she refused to give up her seat because she was tired rather than because of a protest of unfair treatment. But she was already an accomplished civil rights activist by the time of her arrest, having worked for the NAACP and on other civil rights cases. According to Parks in her autobiography, "I was not physically tired, no more than I usually was at the end of the day. I was not old, although some people had this image of me as being old. I was only 42. The only tired that I was tired of giving in." After she was arrested, she would also state that, "I knew that I was being arrested and it was the last time that I would ever ride in humiliation of this kind." She was charged with violating Chapter 6, Section 11 of the segregation law in the Montgomery City Code. In December 1955, Rosa Parks was not the first black woman to refuse to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. 15-year-old Claudette Colvin had been arrested for the exact same offense only 9 months earlier, and dozens of other black women had preceded them in the history of segregated public transit. Additionally, Claudette Colvin, Aria Brower, Susie McDonald, and Marie Louise Smith would lead a successful lawsuit against the Montgomery City bus line in the Brower versus Gale lawsuit later in 1956. But where Rosa Parks differed is that she was the secretary of the local NAACP. Parks had access to resources and publicity that the other women simply did not. After being arrested, she used her one phone call to contact her husband, but word of her arrest quickly spread, and Edgar Nixon, who was the president of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, bailed Parks out of jail that evening. Nixon had hoped for years to find a courageous black woman with solid, unquestioned honesty and integrity to become the plaintiff in a case so that he could attest the validity of the segregation laws. So Nixon convinced Parks, her husband, and her mother that Parks should be that plaintiff. So Parks accepted Nixon's offer. Both Parks and Nixon knew they were opening up themselves for harassment and death threats, but they also knew that this case had the potential to spark a national outrage. Additionally, the idea arose that the black population of Montgomery would boycott buses on the day of Rosa Parks' trial. On December 4th, 1955, plans for the Montgomery bus boycott was announced at black churches in the area. They took out a front page article in the Montgomery Advisor to help spread the word. The next day, December 5th, 1955, Parks was tried on charges of disorderly conduct and violating the local ordinance. The trial lasted only 30 minutes, and Parks was found guilty of violating segregation laws, given a suspended sentence, and fined $10 plus $4 for court fees, which is the equivalent of $142 in today's money. Rosa Parks never paid a dime of this. She would appeal her conviction and formally challenge the legality of racial segregation in Alabama. The same day, 40,000 black commuters commenced the boycott in the rain. Some rode in carpools while others traveled on black-operated cabs that would charge the same fare as the bus, which was around 10 cents. But most black commuters simply walked, many as much as 20 miles. After early success of the boycott, a group of 16 black leaders gathered at Mount Zion AME Zion Church to discuss boycott strategies. The group agreed to start a new organization that would lead the boycott effort if it were to continue. The name, the Montgomery Improvement Association, was adopted. With the MIA being formed, the members elected their president as a 26-year-old relative newcomer to Montgomery, Alabama, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who at the time was a relative unknown minister at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Because at the time, Rosa Parks' case was being slowed up in appeals throughout the Alabama courts on their way to a federal appeal, the process could take years, but African Americans constituted up to 75% of the ridership on the city buses, and the absence of their bus fares cut deeply into the revenue of the Montgomery bus system. Dozens of public buses stood idle for months, severely damaging the bus transit's finances. In the end, the boycott would last 381 days. On November 13th, the Supreme Court would uphold a lower court's decision in Breyer versus Gale, ruling that Montgomery's segregated bus seating was unconstitutional. A court ordered the city to integrate buses by December 20th, and the next day, the boycott ended. Rosa Parks was not included as a plaintiff in the Breyer decision because the attorney Freddie Gray concluded that the courts would perceive they were attempting to circumvent her prosecution on her charges by working their way through the Alabama court system. King wrote in his 1958 book, Stride Towards Freedom, that Parks' arrest was a catalyst rather than the cause for the protests. The cause lay deep in the record of similar injustices. No one could understand the actions of Miss Parks unless they realizes eventually the cup of endurance runs over and people's personality cries out that I can take no longer. After her arrest and subsequent boycott, Parks became an icon of the civil rights movement but suffered many hardships as a result. Her family had serious concerns about their safety and faced economic sanctions. They received threatening phone calls constantly, and Raymond always kept a gun nearby. Parks also lost her job at the department store, and Raymond lost his job as a barber at Maxwell Air Force Base after his boss forbade him to talk about his wife or the legal case. In 1957, Parks moved with her husband to Detroit, where she assisted the campaign of John Connors for Congress in 1964. She persuaded Martin Luther King to appear on behalf of Connors and boosted his national profile, and he in turn hired her on as a secretary and receptionist for his congressional office in Detroit. This is a position that she held until 1988. Despite her fame and constant speaking engagements, Rosa Parks was not a wealthy woman. She donated most of her money from speaking engagements to civil rights causes and lived on her staff's salary and her husband's pensions. Medical bills, missed time for work caused financial strain that required her to accept assistance from church groups and admirers. By 1977, Raymond Parks passed away after a 5-year battle from cancer, followed by her brother and her mother. Despite these hardships, Parks remained active nationally, traveling to the Selma to Montgomery marches, the Freedom Now March, and the Lowdales County Freedom Organization. She also remained active in the NAACP and befriended Malcolm X, who she regarded as a personal hero. In 1998, she co-founded the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development to provide career training for young people and offer teenagers the opportunity to learn about the civil rights movement. In 1999, Rosa Parks filmed her last cameo in a television series Touched by an Angel. It'd be her last appearance on film because of her declining health. Rosa Parks would pass away from natural causes October 24th, 2005. She was 92 years old. Rosa Parks is the first woman in American history to lie in honor at the United States Capitol, and she received numerous honors, including the Congressional Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal. She also wrote an autobiography, Rosa Parks, My Story. In her autobiography, Rosa Parks reflects on all of the progress, stating that young people can register to vote without violence. There are no signs on public water fountains, and big cities have black mayors and black police chiefs. But she was not satisfied. She felt that the United States was failing to respect and protect the lives of African Americans. In one of her last interviews, she stated, I do my very best, and I can look upon my life with optimism and hope and looking forward to a better day. But I don't think there's a such thing as complete happiness. It pains me to see a lot of activity with the Klan and racism. And I think that when you say that you're happy, you have everything that you need and everything that you want, and there's nothing more that you can wish for. And I haven't reached that stage yet. Thank you, country boy. And this has been Life of Rosa Parks. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on my Patreon page or my Buy Me Coffee in the description below. Lastly, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. Peace.